Deleuze Guattari's philosophy is so fun to read, but it can often be really difficult to learn because of their very idiosyncratic use of everyday language. One of the exemplary cases of this is not only becoming animal, but the much more obscure and less talked about concept of becoming imperceptible. In this lecture, I'd like to give a brief explanation via an analogy that I think will help bring a lot of Deleuze and Guattari's language together, such that we can understand how the concepts they use in particularly A Thousand Plateaus pay off when we talk about how we view the world. Because ultimately, Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is a philosophy of creativity. It's about knowing the rules of the game, knowing what are our lines of flight, which is to say our open channels which have yet to be forestalled, and how we might pursue those ends. Becoming in Deleuze and Guattari is all about trying to find a useful and satisfactory way out of an undesirable situation. To become in Deleuze and Guattari is to change, but in a positive direction. To become is going to entail renegotiating the way that a given process occurs. Take, for example, a factory that produces the newspapers of a single company. This company happens to have hegemonic control over the news industry such that there are no other newspapers around, or so they think. What we have here is what Deleuze and Guattari will call a regime of signs. We have a reigning authority controlling what operations are possible for the machines, literally the machines of the factory in this instance, which they are allowed to actuate. Now, every machine is a simple input and output mechanism. Given input, which is within a certain domain of parameters, the newspaper, copier, or maker machine can't, for instance, copy a toaster. It has to be a newspaper it's copying, and a predictable output results. Now, no process is perfect, and every iteration will carry the possibility of, for example, a false flag, where the machine fails to copy a newspaper because the machine flagged it as not being a newspaper. Or the other way around, where the machine fails to catch a runaway toaster attempting to be copied and tries to copy it, and fails. This fallibility is inherent to every regime of signs and every system, and is a key difference between Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard. For Baudrillard, there is true omniscience of the code, as he calls it, where a number of coded activities can infallibly occur indefinitely, such that, for example, reality can be perfectly simulated with no gaps, leaving us an irrevocable spin-down that we cannot escape. This is the crux of his argument for simulacra, for example. Deleuze and Guattari are different. Every process carries with it a fundamental fallibility. Since all forms are fighting against their own decay and acting and changing, aka becoming, to stave off that decay, even the newspaper machine is, for example, rusting and wearing out its parts over time through friction and work. This is just one instance of the fallibility of every regime of signs. Now to connect all this to becoming imperceptible. Remember how I said that given an input which is within a certain domain of parameters, a predictable output results? Well, if we add to our fictional scenario a gang of underground rebels who fight against the narrative made by the newspaper monopoly, we might consider whether or not they too might know of these machines' limitations. For example, the domain of parameters used for their flagging mechanism and regular functioning, as well as what the machines are doing to have one newspaper get fed in and a copy come out. As such, they are aware of what, in Deleuzean terms, we could call the territory. We know how a number of elementary units, in this case newspapers, are acted upon, sorted, and interacted with in a given system. In addition to the elementary units, we know the codes governing the function of the system. Print more newspapers. We also know the agency of the system, the newspaper monopoly. Now, it's important to note that the monopoly is not an agent because it insidiously causes every newspaper to be copied. No, it's because they can control what machines are being used, what elementary units are capable of functioning in a system via that selection of those machines, and what code is to be used in this regime of signs. Now, given that we know all these facts about this regime of signs, we realize that there are a number of lines of flight available to us, open channels of possibility which have not been accounted for or overcoded by the current system. For instance, we can manipulate the given system and cause it to become something new by taking advantage of the limits of perceptibility within that system. The machines can only, so to speak, perceive newspapers. Its elementary units, which it uses to determine whether or not and how it is going to do its job, is newspapers. But the machine isn't even worried about what the newspapers say. It's not worried about the content, just the formal presentation of a general content. It's not concerned with the meaning of the pages, let alone the paragraphs, the sentences, or the words. It's also not concerned with the formal layout of the newspaper or the font of the articles, etc., and etc. As long as there's a viable input that is, quote, a newspaper, then the machine will do its job. Here's where becoming imperceptible comes in. If to be perceptible only makes sense relative to a given system or a regime of signs, which determines what is and is not perceptible, then to come onto the scene and act below the threshold of perceptibility would reveal and bypass the fundamental flaw of the system, its limited domain. Say, for instance, you slip into one of these machines, one of your underground gang's own newspapers. Well, as long as it satisfies the requirements of a newspaper, it will go undetected by the machine since it is below its threshold of perceptibility. That is, it is imperceptible. As such, becoming imperceptible is really about taking advantage of the limitations and fallibility of every system to bring about a desired change through the knowledge of the given and how it can be undercut, exposed, and manipulated. A real-world example of this might be WikiLeaks, the website created by Julian Assange dedicated to leaking classified government information. This was used most famously to expose the cruelty of the U.S. military's operations on innocent civilians during the war in Iraq. Such a leak fundamentally undercut what the U.S. military deemed acceptable public material, thereby exposing a hole in what Americans thought was an honest and forthright establishment. As such, I hope this helps make sense of what it means to become imperceptible for Deleuze and Guattari. I think it's a very apt analogy, but also a very apt philosophical approach that can help us better understand the rules of any socio-political game and how we might chart effective and creative solutions out. That being said, I hope you enjoyed. Please check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd like to donate to the channel, because as a poor college student, I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.